Hey everybody, this is a piece titled Russia, Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Russia by Max Shachtman. This is from the collection of articles from the Third Camp titled The Fate of the Russian Revolution, Lost Texts of Critical Marxism, edited by Sean Matgamna. Not a single Bolshevik leader considered it possible for the Soviet power to endure for a long period of time, much less for Russia to achieve the classless socialist order unless the workers of one or more advanced countries came to its aid. Quote, "When we began the International Revolution," end quote, bracket, said Lenin at the Third Congress of the Communist International in 1921, end bracket, quote, "We thought either the International Revolution comes to our aid and then our victory is quite assured, or else we do our modest revolutionary work and do it in the knowledge that in the event that we suffer defeat, we are able, thereby of use to the cause of revolution, because we make it possible for other revolutions made surer by our experience to do it better. It was clear to us that without the support of the international world revolution, the victory of the proletarian revolution is impossible. Even before the revolution and also afterwards, we reflected either the revolution in the other countries, in the capitalistically more developed countries, comes in immediately or at least in a very swift succession, or we must succumb," end quote. Lenin. Neither the hope nor the prognosis was realized, as is known, yet the Soviet state has not perished. At first blush, this seems to confirm Stalin's nationalistic thesis that a socialist society can be established within a single country, regardless of whether the revolution triumphs in other lands. But only at first blush, for while the Soviet state has not succumbed despite its enforced isolation, it has not only been unable to achieve its socialist goal, but it has been corrupted from within by the deadly cancer of degeneration. The canal through which the poisons have flowed to the heart and head of the regime is the Stalinist bureaucracy. Even before it expropriated the economic power of the bourgeoisie, the Russian Revolution deprived it of its political power. Its place was taken by the rule of the working class, a proletarian democracy, Lenin wrote, quote, "a million times more democratic than any bourgeois democracy, and the Soviet regime a million times more democratic than the most democratic regime in a bourgeois republic," end quote. The Soviet democracy was based on the abolition of professional governmental bureaucracy, divorce from the people, on the indivisibility of the legislative and executive bodies, on the direct rule of the toilers through their deputies to the Soviets, subject at all times to recall, to the armed people as against a professional body of armed men, divorced from the masses, and on the privileged position of the proletariat as the vanguard of the toiling masses. This piece is from, I'm seeing a footnote here that says, this is from the New International, January 1938, the 20th anniversary of the Bolshevik uprising and the degeneration of Soviet power. This is a typical rosy view of early Bolshevik rule by a Trotskyist, which is infinitely more forgivable in 1938 than it is now. While the Bolshevik Party, as the tested and trusted revolutionary vanguard of the proletariat, was the ruling party, it maintained a live and sensitive contact with the toilers through the Soviets, the trade unions, the factory committees, the committees of poor peasants, the cooperatives, and similar institutions. The existence of a wide freedom of discussion and decision in all these bodies of genuine workers' democracy made this interlocking system of institutions the living reality of the political rule of the proletariat, never ideal or flawless, but to be sure but decisive. The counter-revolution of the Stalinist bureaucracy consisted in nothing less than this: it has effectively destroyed all these institutions in the last 14 years, and thereby it has just as effectively expropriated the proletariat politically. Lenin attached, and it has effectively expropriated the proletariat politically. Lenin attached, even if not critically, a tremendous significance to what was called the old guard of the Bolshevik Party. Lenin regarded those veterans who had passed through the three revolutions, the World War and the Civil War, as one of the main assurances that the revolution would continue along its indicated path. Quote, "It must be recognized," end quote, Lenin wrote to the Central Committee in March 1922, quote, "that at the present time the proletarian party policy is determined not so much by its membership as by the unlimited and powerful authority of that thin layer which we may name the old party guard," end quote. The Stalinist bureaucracy, in the course of its reaction to the revolution, its traditions, and its ideology, has destroyed the old guard which embodied them. Take but one example which comes to hand: the Central Committee elected at the Ninth Congress in 1920. Artem Dzerjinsky, Iron Felix, Lenin, Bukharin, Grigory Zinoviev, Lev Kamenev, Krestinsky, Preobrazhensky, Rudzitak, Radek, Rakovsky, Rykov, Serebryakov, Ian Smirnov, Tomsky, Trotsky, Andreev, Kalinin, and Stalin. The first three died of natural causes. Of the rest, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Serebryakov, and Ian Smirnov were murdered by the Stalinists. Tomsky was killed or driven to suicide. Trotsky is in Mexican exile. Bukharin, Krestinsky, Preobrazhensky, Rudzitak, Radek, Rakovsky, and Rykov are imprisoned or disgraced. All of them were eventually executed, I believe. All 13 of them are fascists or wreckers or assassins. Only Stalin, Kalinin, and Andreev remain, which is like saying that only Stalin remains. Important to note in this devastating and uninterrupted purge is the fact that it is not only the generation of defenders of the October Revolution that has been crushed. The Trotskyists or Zinovievists, men like Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Rakovsky, Midvany, Pyatakov, Smirnov, Smilga, Preobrazhensky, Bieloborodov, Muralov, were removed long ago by the Thermidorian generation that brought Stalin to power. Now even the men of the Thermidorian reaction have gone on or are going. Bukharin, Rykov, Rudzitak, Tukhachevsky, Bubnov, Potsyev, and hundreds less well known. I don't know about, we use the word generation here, but Bukharin and Rykov and these people, these are not like these are important people in the history of Bolshevism. Their places are taken up by entirely colorless unknowns. Like Beria, Aika, Zhdanov, Khrushchev, who are not so much party leaders as Stalinist governor-generals who rule in the provinces like Old Turkish Valleys. I don't know the fuck. Wikipedia says a wali, or vali, is an administrative title that was used in the Muslim world, including the Rashidun, Umayyad, and Abbasid caliphates and the Ottoman Empire, to designate governors of administrative divisions. The term Vali is still in use in some countries influenced by Arab or Muslim culture. The division that a Vali governs is titled Wilaye or Vilayet in Ottoman Empire. I wanted to look up the Ninth Congress as well. The Ninth Congress of the Russian Communist Party Bolsheviks took place from 29th of March 1920 to the 5th of April 1920. The Congress opened in the Bolshoi Theater with an introductory speech by Vladimir Lenin. The following meetings of the Congress took place in one of the buildings of the Kremlin. Present at the Congress were 715 delegates, of whom 553 had the right to vote, and 162 were delegates with voice but no vote. The Congress elected the Ninth Central Committee. The agenda included the report of the Central Committee, a report on the immediate tasks of economic construction, a report on the trade union movement, a report on organizational questions, a report on the task of the Communist International, the subject of cooperatives, the transition to a militia system. The final item on the agenda was the election to the Central Committee of the party. Yeah. So I think I might have not finished the last sentence I read. I'm not sure. I'll have to reread it. Their places are taken by entirely colorless unknowns like Beria, Ika, Zhdanov, Khrushchev, who are not so much party leaders as they are made or unmade in a day by simple decree, and their coming and going are like the shadows of a guttering candle flame. Whatever else it may be, a political organization that does not have a free and rich inner life is not a revolutionary proletarian party. In Lenin's time, even after the Mensheviks and social revolutionists had placed themselves outside the Soviet pale by their counter-revolutionary course and left the Bolshevik party with a monopoly of political rule, the party led an intense and active inner life, discussing freely at all times, debating all questions openly, electing, criticizing, and removing its leadership, and deciding the party line at will. Under the gunfire of the Kronstadt mutiny and the echoes of the peasant risings in Tambov and elsewhere, the 10th Congress adopted the entirely exceptional and temporary emergency measure prohibiting separate factions with separate platforms. This unprecedented limitation on party democracy, however, was adopted with numerous significant reservations. The adopted resolution stated, quote, "It is necessary that every party organization takes rigorous care that the absolutely necessary criticism of the shortcomings of the party, all analyses of the general party direction, all appraisals of its practical experience, every examination of the carrying out of the party decisions and of the means of correcting the mistakes, etc., shall not be discussed in separate groups standing upon any platform, but rather in the meetings of all party members. Toward this end, the Congress decides to publish a periodical discussion sheet and special periodicals. Everyone who comes forward with a criticism must take into consideration the position of the party in the midst of its encircling enemies, and he must also strive in his direct activity in Soviet and party circles to correct the mistakes of the party in practice." While the Congress orders the Central Committee to exterminate all factionalism, the conference declares at the same time that those questions which attract the special attention of the party membership, e.g., on the purging of the party of unproletarian, unreliable elements, on the struggle against bureaucratism, on the development of democracy and the broader participation of the workers, etc., and in general, all objective proposals must be examined with the utmost possible scrupulousness and tested practically. All party members must know that the party cannot take all the required measures in these questions, since it encounters a whole series of the most varied obstacles, and that while the party decisively rejects an unobjective and factional criticism, it will continue tirelessly to test new methods and to fight with all means against bureaucratism and for the extension of the democracy of the self-active masses, for the uncovering, exposure, and expulsion of all unreliable elements from the party." End quote. Not aimed at suppressing democracy, even the restrictions of the 10th Congress were designed to extend discussion and criticism, to organize it, to ferret out bureaucratism, and to do all this in a manner that would be less dangerous and factional under the concrete conditions. When at the same Congress Ryazanov moved an amendment prohibiting election of delegates to coming Congresses on the basis of factional platforms, Lenin was quick to sense the danger, replied, quote, "I think that the desire of Comrade Ryazanov is unfortunately not realizable. If fundamental disagreements exist on a question, we cannot deprive members of the Central Committee of the right to address themselves to the party. I cannot imagine how we can do this. The present Congress can in no way and in no form engage the elections in the next Congress, and if, for example, questions like the Brest-Litovsk peace arise, can we guarantee that such questions will not arise? It cannot be guaranteed. It is possible that it will then be necessary to elect by platform. That's quite clear," end quote. Lenin. And again elsewhere during the same period, Lenin wrote, quote, "But if deep fundamental disagreements of principle exist, we may be told, quote, do they not justify the sharpest factional action, end quote? Naturally, they justify it if the disagreements are really deep and if the rectification of the wrong policy of the party or of the working class cannot be obtained otherwise," end quote. Lenin. In the period of acute danger to the Soviet regime, when it had to make the painful and hazardous transition to the new economic policy, and when the party imposed certain organizational restraints upon itself, Lenin nevertheless called for freedom of discussion and criticism, for internal discussion organs, and acknowledged the permissibility and even inevitability of factions, platforms, and the, quote, "sharpest factional action," end quote. By this he was merely testifying to the existence of a living party. Again, there's much to dispute this, especially with the notion of the Kronstadt insurrection being a mere mutiny. Subsequent research would have much negative things to say about this kind of like gloss of the events of the Russian Revolution. The only people that would hold on to it are people who have a stake in upholding Leninism as a political practice, not people who are interested in objective history or consistently putting forward a socialist position that was not... never mind. Forget that last bit. Basically, none of the people who would say these things are Leninists. No one would grant this kind of... No one would, I don't think any objective historian, quasi-objective historian would agree with this assessment. Important books on this would be Simon Perani's The Russian Revolution and Retreat, Oscar Anweiler's The Soviets, and many others. The books on Kronstadt by Israel Getzler and Paul Average would also challenge this thesis, as well as R.V. Daniels' The Conscience of the Revolution. The Stalinist bureaucracy has changed all that. It started with the Trotsky Zinoviev opposition. In 1927, it prohibited the publication of their platform, arrested those leaders and militants who mimeographed it for circulation in a pre-Congress discussion period, and expelled all those who defended it. It demanded not only that the opposition supporters cease advocating the views in their platform, but that they cease believing those views. In 1932, Stalin demanded the execution of the old Bolshevik Ryutin for circulating a, quote, platform, end quote, which ended with Lenin's demand that Stalin be removed from his post. Ryutin was, quote, merely, end quote, imprisoned by the GPU. In the last few years, the years of Stalinist domination, not one single word of criticism of the party leadership has been uttered, not one single proposal different from the proposals of the Führer. Nobody dares. Yet there are differences of opinion whispered about and muttered in tiny grouplets. Only the party does not decide these differences. The party is dead. The GPU decides them in accordance with the instructions of the Secretariat. The Congress of the Party is its highest and most authoritative instance, selecting the leadership to carry out the line of policy which the Congress adopts. At least so it was in Lenin's time. The question of seizing power, the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, the new economic policy, the trade union question, all these were decided at party congresses after the fullest discussion of all the conflicting standpoints. In the Stalinist epoch, congresses no longer take place. In their stead, the bureaucracy organizes palace assemblies of hand-picked lieges who listen without discussion to the throne speech of the Führer. The lesser bureaucrats appear only for the purpose of burning frankincense to Stalin and of giving Stalin assurances of their blind fealty in terms reminiscent of the fawning speeches made by provincial princelings to an oriental potentate. Just think, in the days of illegality and thin purses under Tsarist despotism, the Russian party nevertheless held 4 regular congresses between July 1903 and 1907. Of party conferences under Tsarism, there were 8, from the Tamarfors meeting in 1905 to the Poronino meeting of 1913. In the revolutionary period between the overthrow of the Tsar and the death of Lenin, the party held 8 regular party congresses and 7 conferences. The Stalinist record is quite different. The first real post-Lenin Congress was the 14th in December 1925. The 15th was held 2 years later. Between it and the 16th, 2.5 years were allowed to elapse between the 16th and the 17th Congress, the last to be held in January 1934. More than 3.5 years went by. The statutes adopted by the Stalinists themselves at the 17th Congress provided that, quote, regular congresses are convened no less than once in 3 years, end quote. In cynical violation of its own statutes, the bureaucracy has let 4 years pass, and the fiction of a party is not even allowed to hold its fiction of a Congress. And what 4 years these have been! What drastic changes the bureaucracy has made without even going through the formality of consulting the party. Under the Stalinist bureaucracy, the Bolshevik Party, if it may be called that, has been allowed to meet in Congress again, if it may be called that, only 4 times in more than 13 years. The party met more often under the Tsar. The bureaucracy has crushed the old party. In the early days of the revolution, the Bolsheviks regarded trade unions as a school of communism and as one of the institutions through which the workers ruled in the factories and Soviets. The Bolsheviks did not fear debate and discussion, and as late as 1920, almost 3 years after the revolution, Stalin and Martov could still appear as the official representatives of the Menshevik Party at the Third Congress of the Trade Unions to present their views and debate the Bolshevik spokesman. But even more, the Bolsheviks regarded the trade unions as an indispensable instrument for the defense of proletarian interest from the transgressions, abuses, and wantonness of the state itself, and especially of its bureaucracy. It was only in 1927 that Molotov put forward the bigoted, bureaucratic conception that since Russia is a workers' state, there can be no question of defending the workers from it. Lenin had nothing in common with this bureaucratic idealism. Speaking before the party fraction of the 8th Soviet Congress of December 30th, 1921, during the discussion on the trade union question, he said, quote, Comrade Trotsky speaks of the worker state. Permit me, that is an abstraction. When we wrote about the worker state in 1917, that was understandable. When it is said today, why defend? Defend the working class against whom? There's no longer a bourgeoisie. We don't have a worker state. Then an obvious error is being committed. Don't we have a worker state? Then an obvious error is being committed. The whole joke is that it is not quite a worker state. That's where the basic mistake of Comrade Trotsky lies. We have passed over from general principles to objective discussion and to decrees, but that's where we are being held back from practical objective work. That will not do. Our state is in reality no worker state, but a workers' and peasant state. A whole lot follows from that. But still more, from our party program, it follows that our state is a worker state with bureaucratic deformations. We have to paste this, how shall we call it, a sorry label on it. That is, the reality of the transition. Our present state is such that the organized proletariat must defend itself, and we must utilize these workers' organizations for the defense of the workers against their state and for the defense of the state by the workers. End quote. Lenin. What a decisive role Lenin assigned to the trade unions in this profoundly dialectical concept of the interrelations between the economic organizations of the workers and the real, not idealistically perfect worker state, a concept beyond the grasp of superficial minds accustomed to abstract and absolute categories. The trade unions are an instrument for the defense of the worker state and the defense of the workers from that worker state. And if the latter was necessary 17 years ago, how infinitely more urgent it is today that the trade unions defend the workers from a regime in which the bureaucratic cancer has grown to monstrous, undreamed-of proportions. What, for example, has happened to the right to strike solemnly organized by the Party Congress in Lenin's time? Most likely it has not been abolished by law, only the exercise of that right is rewarded by a prompt visit by the GPU. The right to intervene in the question of hiring and firing and management in general was taken from the trade unions, from the factory committee, and from the party nucleus in the factory. In September 1929, the trade unionists and the unions themselves are silent in the face of the most abominable abuses of the factory directors. The bitterness of the average worker against the growing disparity between his wages and the salary of the industrial bureaucrat or the labor aristocrat who carries the title of Stakhanovite is felt in the heart and muttered in the most discreet privacy, but is not expressed in or through the trade unions. The trade union leadership is composed of case-hardened bureaucrats appointed from above and removed just as easily. They know that they have neither obligations nor responsibilities to the ranks nor the under their control. As a result, the Soviet press is compelled to print countless depressing reports of wantonness, irresponsibility, embezzlement, brutality, and degeneration among the trade union officialdom. The worker does not know today who will be the head of his trade union tomorrow. He is not consulted in knowing quite well that he has a union in name only. He cares precious little. He is aware that the armed guard who watches over him in the mine pit is far more real and far more powerful than the empty shell that was once the Russian trade union movement. The first All-Russian Congress of the Trade Unions met in January 1918, the second early in 1919, the third in April 1920, the ninth Congress met toward the end of 1928, the 10th Congress early in 1932. Since then, that is, for almost 6 crucial years, there has been no Congress. If one knew nothing else about the Russian trade unions, the comparison between the two sets of dates would suffice to indicate the difference between a living movement, a real foundation stone, and the structure of proletarian democracy and a fiction. But behind the fiction stands the usurpatory bureaucracy. The Russian Revolution laid bare the Soviets, the councils of workers, soldiers, peasants, as the most natural and most democratic, most efficient form of proletarian state rule in the transition period between capitalism and communism. In all other countries where a revolutionary situation matured, Soviets, just like the Russian, are slightly varied in form, developed spontaneously as the embryonic organs of insurrection and power, and not as a product artificially imported from Russia. The original Soviets were a million times more democratic than any bourgeois republic, precisely because they smashed the monopoly of the professional capitalist politician and bureaucrat whose relationship with the masses is confined to electoral campaigns once a year or less often. The Soviets made it possible for the masses to throw off the yoke of, quote, voting cattle, end quote, which bourgeois rule imposes upon the masses, and to act as the direct, independent administrators of their own affairs. I'm going to repeat that because it's in italics. Direct, independent administrators of their own affairs. Unsatisfactory representatives could be recalled at will and replaced by others. Lenin saw especially in the right of recall not only one of the main pillars of Soviet democracy, but also a guarantee of the peaceful settlement of conflicts and disputes in the country. 4 weeks after the Bolshevik uprising, he said at a session of the All-Russian Central Executive Committee of the Soviets, quote, "Various parties have played a dominant role among us. The last time the passage of influence from one party to another was accompanied by a fairly stormy overturn, whereas a simple vote would have sufficed had we had the right of recall, ... The right of recall must be granted the Soviets, which are the most perfect carrier of the state idea of coercion. Then the passage of power from one party to another will proceed without bloodshed by means of simple new elections," end quote. Lenin, December 1917. The whole course of the Stalinist bureaucracy climaxed by a, quote, democratic election under the new democratic constitution, end quote, which is gruesomely mocked by the never-ceasing purge, has proceeded by trampling underfoot every one of the conceptions of the place and function of the Soviets, which prevailed in the early years of the revolution, from the local Soviets to the Central Executive Committee itself. The administrations are appointed and removed at will by the corresponding party apparatus, bosses, and without slightest intervention of the masses themselves. The right of recall exists, to be sure, but it is exercised only by the Stalinist bureaucracy. What Soviet institution, what mass organization or movement intervened, for example, to remove the recently condemned People's Commissar of White Russia, of the Ukraine, of Georgia, and of the RSFSR, of the Soviet Union, and to put others in their place? Only the GPU, acting as administrative agent of the party secretariat. What, quote, democratic, end quote, significance had the new constitutional rights of free speech, free press, and free assembly when they are enjoyed exclusively and even limited by the myrmidons of the bureaucracy, who are themselves under the constant surveillance of the secret police? Wikipedia says myrmidons in Greek mythology, myrmidons are an ancient Thessalian Greek tribe. In Homer's Iliad, the Myrmidons are the soldiers commanded by Achilles. The Myrmidons' eponymous ancestor was Myrmidon, a king of Theodius, who is son of Zeus and, quote, wide-ruling, end quote, Eurymedeusa, a princess of Thetis. In one account, Zeus seduced Eurymedeusa in the form of an ant. An etiological myth of their origins simply expanded upon their supposed etymology. The name in classical Greek was interpreted as, quote, ant people, from myrmidon, and which means, quote, ant nest, unquote, was first mentioned by Ovid in the Metamorphoses. In Ovid's telling that myrmidons were simple worker ants on the island of Aegina. And all the pictures of myrmidons, the definition, according to that you look up when you type in myrmidons, was a follower or subordinate of a powerful person, typically one who's unscrupulous or carries out orders unquestioningly. Back to the text. What value has the secret ballot when there is but one candidate to choose from, and he handpicked by the apparatus? The elections of the Soviets and all their alleged legislative and executive bodies are classic examples of Bonapartist plebiscites. They are an abominable caricature of Soviet democracy, the very negation of it. And a plebiscite is the direct vote of all the members of an electorate on an important public question, such as a change in the Constitution. The bureaucracy has strangled the Soviets of the revolution. The political rule of the workers and peasants has been supplanted by the political rule of the bureaucracy and those social strata which are its direct props. What a revealing story there is in the social composition of the guaranteed to be elected candidates of the Council of the Union. Of actual workers and peasants, there are none of them, or next to none. The overwhelming majority of the candidates is made up of party officials, factory directors, labor aristocrats, Stakhanovites, GPU and army officers, well-to-do farmers, that is, the reactionary bureaucracy and its associated social layers. The Soviets were to make it possible, in Lenin's words, for any charwoman, for the lowest and most despised, to become the administrator of the state, so that it would no longer be, properly speaking, a state in the old sense of a bureaucratic apparatus of oppression with special bodies of armed men separate and apart from the people. The triumph of the Stalinist bureaucracy has been accomplished by the political expropriation of the charwoman of the proletariat. The charwoman of the proletariat. It signifies the victory of the political counter-revolution. The political counter-revolution. At home, the bureaucracy has not yet been able to free itself from the confines of the economic basis achieved by the Russian Revolution, about which more later, but abroad it has a free hand, so to speak, and there its course is openly counter-revolutionary. It is the gendarme of law and order, of the status quo throughout the capitalist world. A comparison between the situation even in 1923, when the reactionary tumor was already apparent in the Soviet body, and in 1937, when the totalitarian bureaucracy is celebrating its triumph, will indicate the profound change. In 1923, when the German Revolution was expected, the Soviet Republic stood at attention to aid it. The harbor of Petrograd was filled with grain ships ready to sail for Stettin to the German Soviet Republic, so that the German Soviet Republic would not be starved out by the Entente. Representatives of the Comintern and the Russian Party were active on German soil, preparing for the uprising as best they could under the leadership of Brandler and Zinoviev. Specialists of the Red Army were assigned to give expert assistance to the German communists. The close diplomatic alliance existing at that time between the Soviets and German bourgeois republic had not converted the International into the main prop of German capitalism. Quite the contrary. In 1937, all the diplomatic moves in Europe, all the aid sent by the Soviet Union to the Spanish loyalists in the form of munitions, arms, military experts, GPU agents, etc., are directed towards crushing the proletarian revolution in Spain, preserving Spanish bourgeois democracy as an instrument in the hands of Anglo-French imperialism. The policy of Stalin in Spain is distinguished from that of Noska and Shachtman in the Germany of 1919 only by its more systematic savagery. Noska and Shachtman were the people at the head of the newly established Weimar Republic, at least in my understanding, the head of the newly established Weimar Republic, and represent the right wing of German social democracy. All the policies of the Soviet bureaucracy are based upon its self-preservation. Abroad, at the very least, in the international labor movement and class struggle, it is indisputable that the interests of the Soviet bureaucracy come into head-on conflict with the interests of the working class. These interests produce not the policies of the Mensheviks of 1905 or even of 1917, but those of the Mensheviks who took up arms in alliance with Anglo-French imperialism in 1918 to 1919 to overthrow the young Soviet Republic. They are not just non-revolutionary policies, they are the policies of counter-revolution. What remains of the Russian Revolution? Why should we defend the Soviet Union in case of war? A number of realities still remain. The conflict between German fascism and fundamentally also of the capitalist world as a whole in the Soviet Union still remains no less a reality than, let us say, the conflict between fascism and social democracy or the trade unions, regardless of how corrupt may be the leadership of the latter, regardless of how it may compromise and capitulate, regardless of how much it may seek to place itself under the protection of one capitalist force, as did the Austrian social democracy against another. The conflict can be resolved only by the capitalist world being overturned by the working class, or by the Soviet Union, its present bureaucracy included, being crushed and reduced to the status of a colonial or semi-colonial country, divided among the world's imperialist bandits. Another great reality in the economic foundation established by the October Revolution. Despite bureaucratic mismanagement and parasitism, we have the prodigious economic advances made by Soviet industry, the great expansion of the productive forces in Russia, without which human progress is generally inconceivable, in a period of stagnation and retrogression in the capitalist world, the principle and practice of economic planning. All these are possible only on the basis of the abolition of socially operated private property, of the nationalization of the means of production and exchange, their centralization in the hands of the state, which is the main prerequisite for an evolution towards the classless society of universal abundance, leisure, and unprecedented cultural advance. It seems like at this time that Shachtman is still accepting Trotsky's analysis of the USSR. Accepting the degenerated worker state thesis, because this is precisely what Trotsky would. This is basically like a recapitulation. Summarization of what was said in The Revolution Betrayed, which is on this channel if you're curious. Outraged by the brutality of the reactionary usurpers, by their blood purges, by their political expropriation of the toilers, by their totalitarian regime, more than one class-conscious worker and revolutionary militant has concluded that nothing is left of the Russian Revolution, and there are no more grounds for defending the Soviet Union in a war than for defending any capitalist state. The professional confusionists of the various ultra-leftist groupslets prey upon these honest reactions to Stalinism and to try to goad the workers into a reactionary position. Some of these philosophers of ignorance and superficiality prescribe a position of neutrality in the war between the Soviet Union and Germany. Others, less timid, call for the strategy of defeatism in the Soviet Union. At bottom, the ultra-leftist position on the Soviet Union, which denies it any claim whatsoever to being a workers' state, reflect the vacillations of the petty bourgeoisie, their inability to make a firm choice between the camps of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, of revolution and imperialism. I can't really quite say who is being referred to here. I couldn't tell you, but I'm one of the people I might be guessing is, I think, like it could be Souverain, it could be who else? I'm trying to think of the other person. I think one of the main ones. I think like the left opposition in Germany, represented by, I can't think his name, Hugo Orbans, I think might be his name. I think in Germany the left opposition was way more quick to rule out the notion that the USSR was a worker state. I believe that's probably who is being referenced here. I don't think the ultra-leftism that he's referring to, unless he names otherwise, is referring to like council communism or something like that. Class rule is based upon property relations. Bourgeois class rule. The bourgeois state is based upon private ownership, appropriation, and accumulation. The political superstructure of the bourgeois class state may vary: democratic republic, monarchy, fascist dictatorship. When the bourgeoisie can no longer rule directly politically and the working class is still too weak to take power, a Bonapartist military dictatorship may arise which seeks to raise itself, quote, above the classes, end quote, to, quote, mediate, end quote, between them. But it continues to rule over a bourgeois state, even though, as in Germany, it has politically expropriated the bourgeoisie and its parties because it has left bourgeois property relations more or less intact. The October Revolution abolished the bourgeois property relations in the decisive spheres of economic life by centralizing the means of production in the hands of the state. It created new property relations. The counter-revolutionary bureaucracy, although it has destroyed the political rule of the proletariat, has not yet been able to restore capitalist property and relations of abolishing those established by the revolution. This great reality determines for Marxists the character of the Soviet Union as a worker state, bureaucratically degenerated is true, usurped, and therefore crucially imperiled by the Bonapartists, but still fundamentally a worker state. This great remaining conquest of the revolution determines in turn our defense of the Soviet Union from imperialist attack and from its Bonapartist sappers at home. Okay, so this is a very important paragraph in my opinion, because this is precisely the argument that Shachtman, or at least like the bureaucratic collectivist theorists in the future are going to critique, right? Is that this fundamental conflation between a bourgeois state and a worker state, that in a bourgeois state, which radically separates the economy from the state, especially in like extremes of like laissez-faire form, you can have a very reactionary state, but insofar as it allows private property and the market to proceed its course, it can definitely, what is said about like the Bonapartist state can be true, right? The bourgeoisie might have limited access to the state because the state is like not democratically organized. It can be in a highly authoritarian state. It can be all kinds of states, you know, take on different political features. But a worker state is fundamentally different insofar as that gap between like politics and economics is brought together. And so you cannot have a worker state you cannot have a merely nationalizing property cannot dictate the content of whether or not the state is a worker state, because now that the economy is repoliticized in a certain sense, the democratic content of that state really matters a lot for the economic content of that state. So you can't have merely nationalizing property cannot constitute, and the presence of planning cannot constitute a state as a worker state. It might be anti-capitalist, but it doesn't constitute a worker state. There's a certain there's very much a democratic necessity for a state to be a worker state. Whereas in a bourgeois state, generally speaking, does not necessarily need to have a democratic content for the economic power of the bourgeoisie to flourish, right? Whereas if the workers are disempowered in a collectivized state, a state of collectivized property, it loses its feature as a worker state, and it's something else. And this is a note for myself, and I think this is like what is really the powerful is like I tend to sympathize, I think, more so with the state capitalist thesis than a lot of these other people. I think a lot of than the bureaucratic collectivist thesis. I think the state capitalist thesis seems a little bit more promising and is a little more rich and robust. On the other hand, what I think, and this I've said this a bunch of times in videos, on the other hand, I think that what is really rich in terms of like thought about thinking about socialism, with that like the really rich contribution of the bureaucratic collectivists is that whether or not Stalinism is capitalist or anti-capitalist is not the point. It can be anti-capitalist and not a worker state at the same time. It can be a planned economy and not a worker state at the same time. Wealth cannot take the form of a commodity and it still not be a worker state or a state that is heading in a socialist or emancipatory direction. And I think that's really, really, really important. The idea that like the non-cap, whether like granted, if you grant that the Stalinism was anti-capitalist, which I think in certain respects you can, in other certain respects you can't. But just assuming that it was the most anti-capitalist system that you could possibly ever fathom, that is insufficient criteria for declaring it as a worker state, a dictatorship of the proletariat, a society that a form of a political establishment that was in some way leading beyond the confines of capitalism. And I think that's the really rich contribution of the bureaucratic collectivists. But even if what they empirically say about the Soviet Union or their analysis is not apt about like what their alternative to the degenerated worker state thesis is not convincing, for purposes of for political purposes, in terms of conceptions of socialism, in terms of political clarification, I think the contribution is utterly tremendous. I think it really, there's a piece by Marcel Stutzler, who's like a critical theory guy, and he's not affiliated with this like train of thought at all, but he has a piece that's like about like, what if what comes after capitalism is not emancipatory, and that I think that the bureaucratic collectivists really put that question like very much like on the agenda, right? Especially, like it really tried to take stock of the fact that it appeared that for much of socialist history, rightly or wrongly, I think probably wrongly, but but it's understandable. There was two options. There was socialism or there was capitalism, right? And capitalism was going to end, just kind of degenerate into barbarism with endless wars and whatnot. Or there's going to be socialism. That kind of like dualistic thinking was baffled by political development and the coming into being of Stalinism. And I think that that's like really the beauty and importance of the contribution, even if it's limited, of bureaucratic collectivist thought. And that's why I have so much, interest and respect for third camp positions. Yeah. And it's also like you don't need to declare the Soviet Union to be a worker state to not think it should be intact by like Nazi Germany, right? Like you don't have to say that USSR was a worker state to say that Barbarossa was one of the most disgusting, horrific things to happen in the 20th century and in human history in general, right? You don't have to say that a society is perfect in order to argue for like against its warfare, right? Like it's against its encroachment, right? Or invasion by other powers or its subordination to other powers, right? You don't have to say that. But that's not from like revolutionary reasons. That's just from like ethical reasons. And I think in times of like, and like, you know, a lot of these people are operating with the notion of a lot of extreme like revolutionary optimism that the end of capitalism is extremely imminent and stuff like that, which I think they were all proved wrong by that. Like for the ethical reasons of like the human cost of what an invasion or a conquering of a country means is and what it means for like even just like the barest minimum of democratic or human rights or human self-determination is the reason why it is bad, right? It is not good. Like I don't have any illusions, for instance, about like the socialist character or even like the democratic robustness of Ukraine. But that doesn't mean that I support its subordination or actively oppose it defending itself against Russia. And seeking recourses to defend itself from Russia, right? You don't need to have, you know, and that's just a whole thing. I'd like to read it, but I think there's like a critique by Hal Draper somewhere about Russians' notion of Lenin's notion of like revolutionary defeatism, right? Where he talks about how like defeatism, I'm not exactly sure, especially I think Draper criticizes it mostly in terms of it becoming a reified dogma. But the idea, like defeatism of one's own country, is advocacy for the other country, right? It's not, you don't just like, there's other ways of understanding wars, like peace without annexations or, you know, conquest or whatever. Like that's one form of like opposing the war, opposing warfare, which is different from, say, revolutionary defeatism or whatever, where you like actively seek the sabotaging of your own country, the country that you reside in, because that's just thwarting your own personal bourgeois state for the benefit of another. So it kind of like it's like and it's like it has the idea, oh, it's anti-nationalist or whatever, but it's like anti-nationalism, I think, like would consist of not just like is not like a consistent critique of nationalism is not a one-sided critique of a particular nation, right? So it's not anti-nationalist within the system of nation states to oppose a nation's sovereignty, right? That's not a cosmopolitan answer to that question. Sorry, I'm talking to myself. I'm lonely. Like the answer to the anti-nationalist response is not to just be anti-nationalist of your own country, but to be anti-nationalist in general. Like I think it's mistaken to be like, you know, and this is where people get into like shitty reactionary like geopolitics, I think, is like when they think that when they act as if they're putting forward a universalistic cosmopolitan internationalist position by selectively choosing which nationalisms it views as acceptable, right? Sorry, I just rambled on. Basically, what am I saying here? Back to the text. sorry for that interlude. That's a pretty extensive marginalia by myself that doesn't even directly pertain to what's being said. But basically, it appears here that Shachtman is still applying a degenerated worker state thesis to the USSR at this period, which again, this is written in 1938. Because it is not a simple question, Lenin pointed out at the 9th Congress of the party in 1920, we must be careful not to sink into the morass of confusion. Quote, wherein consists the rule of the class? Wherein consists the rule of bourgeoisie over the feudal lords? In the Constitution it was written, quote, freedom and equality, end quote. That is a lie. So long as there are toilers, the property owners are capable and as such even compelled to speculate. We say that there is no equality here and that the sated are not the equals of the hungry, the speculator is not the equal of the toiler. Wherein does the rule of the class express itself? The rule of the proletariat expresses itself in the abolition of landed and capitalist property. Even the fundamental content of all former constitutions, the Republican included, boiled down to property. Our Constitution has acquired the right to historical existence. We did not merely write down on paper that we were abolishing property, but the victorious proletariat did abolish property and abolished property completely. Therein consists the rule of the class, primarily in the question of property. When the question of property was decided in practice, the rule of the class was thereby assured. Thereby the Constitution wrote down on paper what life had decided. Quote, there is no capitalist in landed property. End quote. And it added, quote, the working class has more rights than the peasantry, but the exploiters have no rights at all. End quote. Therewith was written down the manner in which we realized the rule of our class, in which we bound together the toilers of all strata, all the little groups. The petty bourgeois proprietors were split up. Among them, those who have a large property are the foes of those who have less, and the proletariat openly declares war against them when it abolishes property. ... The rule of the class is determined only by the relationship to property. That is precisely what determines the Constitution. And our Constitution correctly sets down our attitude to property and our attitude to the question of what class must stand at the head. He who in the question of how the rule of the class is expressed falls into the question of democratic centralism, as we often observe, brings so much confusion into the matter that he makes impossible any successful work on this ground. End quote. Lenin. Where the hell are we? Sorry, I pressed a button and now I'm lost. Okay, yeah, Lenin, July 1920. Liberal apologists have distorted Lenin's concept into an argument for the compatibility of the bureaucratic dictatorship and even a personal dictatorship with a consistent development towards the new social order. Quote, so long as industry remains nationalized and the productive forces expand, end quote, runs their apology. Quote, what does it really matter if Stalin maintains a bureaucratic despotism, which we civilized liberals would not tolerate, but which is good enough for backward Russians, end quote. It is, of course, quite true that Lenin saw no absolute incompatibility between proletarian democracy and, quote, individual dictatorship, end quote, in industry under given conditions. A year before his quoted speech at the 9th Congress, he observed, quote, that the dictatorship of single persons in the history of revolutionary movements is very often the spokesman, the carrier, and the executant of the dictatorship of the revolutionary class, is evidenced by the incontestable experience of history. If we are not anarchists, we must acknowledge the necessity of the state, i.e. of coercion, for the transition from capitalism to socialism. The form of coercion is determined by the degree of development of the given revolutionary class. Furthermore, by such special circumstances as e.g. the heritage of a long reactionary war, furthermore by the forms of the resistance of the bourgeoisie or of the petty bourgeoisie. Therefore, there is not the slightest contradiction in principle between Soviet, i.e. socialist democracy, and the application of the dictatorial rule of individual persons, end quote. But in order to make clear his real thoughts, Lenin hastened to add the following indispensable supplementary statement without which everything is one-sided and therefore false. Quote, The more resolutely we now come out in favor of a ruthlessly strong power for the dictatorship of individual persons in definite labor processes during certain periods of purely executive functions, the more manifold must be the forms and methods of control from below in order to paralyze every trace of a possibility of distorting the Soviet power, in order to tear out incessantly and tirelessly the weeds of bureaucratism, end quote. It is precisely those manifold forms and methods of democratic control from below, which the bureaucracy has destroyed in its development toward despotic rule. In destroying proletarian democracy and political rule of the working class, the bureaucracy has lifted the bureaucracy's self beyond the reach of the masses out of which it emerged. Having abandoned its original class base, it must find a new one, where it cannot last long as a thin bureaucratic stratum hanging, so to speak, in midair. The social layers with which it has linked itself are the well-to-do farmers, the factory directors and trust heads, the Stakhanovite aristocracy, the officialdom of the party, the Soviet apparatus, the Red Army, and the GPU. But none of these, nor all of them, taken together, represent a class, with a distinct function in the productive life of the country, or with specific property forms upon which to build a firm class and firm class rule. Their whole tendency is to develop into a new property-owning class, that is, into a capitalist class based on private property. Blocking the road to the realization of this yearning stands the still powerful reality of the nationalization of the means of production and exchange, centralized planning, and the protection of nationalized industry, which is afforded by the monopoly of foreign trade. The bureaucracy, closely interlinked with these restorationist strata of Soviet society and embodying their social aspirations, is now driven by inexorable force to take its next big step backward. Hitherto, the reaction has been confined essentially to the destruction of the whole political superstructure of the workers' democracy established by the revolution, and to the physical annihilation of all those who are the living connection between today and the revolutionary yesterday. From now on, the anti-Soviet bureaucracy will, and in certain sense must, seek its self-preservation by an assault upon the economic foundations of the workers' state, nationalized property, planning, the monopoly of foreign trade. In our opinion, it cannot and will not succeed in establishing the rule of an independent new Russian capitalist class, even if we arbitrarily exclude the possibility, by no means exhausted, of the crushing of the counter-revolutionary bureaucracy by a resurgent proletariat. The new strata of society gathered around the Soviet ruling clique may prevail over the Russian proletariat in the period to come. But we do not believe that they are strong or solidly rooted enough to develop into a national neo-bourgeoisie capable of resisting, on a capitalist basis, the infinitely stronger bourgeoisie of the foreign imperialist countries. In other words, the Stalinist bureaucracy and the Stalinist bureaucracy's satellites are doomed regardless of the outcome. They cannot develop into an independent ruling capitalist class in Russia. Either they are defeated by the proletariat, which carries through a political revolution for the purpose of restoring workers' democracy and of safeguarding the economic basis of the workers' state which still exists, or they are defeated by powerful foreign imperialism, which would wipe out the old economic basis, reduce the Union to a semi-colonial country, and convert the restorationist strata not into a ruling capitalist class for Russia, but merely into a comprador agency of world imperialism, occupying a position not dissimilar from that of the Chinese national bourgeoisie. The class-conscious workers will place all their hopes and bend all their efforts toward the realization of the former outcome of the struggle, the building of the Revolutionary Party. To lead the Russian masses in the battle to save the Russian Revolution is dependent upon the success of the revolutionary movement in the capitalist world. The depression and reaction in the ranks of the Russian proletariat was created by the defeats of the working class in the rest of the world, by the defeat of the Russians, that they had no powerful allies. The depression and reaction in the ranks of the Russian proletariat was created by the defeats of the working class in the rest of the world, by the feeling of the Russians that they had no powerful allies in the capitalist world. The growth and victories of the Fourth International will galvanize the latent revolutionary strength of the Russian masses and set it into irresistible motion. Everything depends on the speed with which we accomplish our indicated task. This is written in 1938, which is the same year that the Fourth International was officially established. 1 second, I gotta get some coffee. The crisis of the Russian Revolution has emboldened all the critics of Bolshevism, that is, of revolutionary Marxism, all of them old and new, but all their hoary arguments leave the Marxist unrepentant for his solidarity with those principles and ideas which made the Russian Revolution possible. For in abandoning these ideas, he would have to adopt others, and what others are there? Should he adopt those of the Mensheviks? It is true, had they triumphed, the proletarian revolution in Russia would not have degenerated into its Stalinist caricature for the simple reason that there would have been no proletarian revolution. Should we adopt the Western European confreres of the Mensheviks, the parties of the Second International? It is true they did not let the proletarian revolution in Germany and Austria and Italy degenerate, and that by the simple device of crushing it in the egg and thus facilitating the consolidation of their famous bourgeois democracy, which brought the working class directly under the knife of Hitler and Schuschnigg and Mussolini. Who the fuck is Schuschnigg? Well, the internet's not working. Should he adopt those of the anarchist politicians who have become so clamorous of late, especially about the Kronstadt rebellion? But the lamentable collapse of anarchist politics in Spain, the servile collaboration with the bourgeoisie, the heaping of capitulation upon capitulation, and the yielding of one position after another without a struggle, are not calculated to attract us away from Marxism. As a side note, there's anarchist critiques as well of the anarchist, or CNT, the participation of CNT officials, at least, in the Spanish Republic. Yeah. And I believe that in retrospect, I'm not exactly sure, so I might be talking out my butt, but I think in retrospect, the leader of the Trotskyist in Spain, Grandizo Muniz, became way more sympathetic to the anarchist in the Spanish Civil War than he might have been at the time. I know, at the very least, know that Grandizo Muniz, leader of the Bolshevik Leninists in the Spanish Revolution, did move to more libertarian positions after the Spanish Civil War. Back to the text. It's not. Also, I forget what the piece is called. Now I'm just going to talk out my butt. Vernon Richards, The Spanish Revolution, is a anarchist communist critique of the CNT. It's not as and it's I don't know. It's and the fact of its collaboration in the loyalist or Republican government during the Spanish Civil War. So merely critiquing the entrance of CNT officials into the bourgeois government during the Spanish Civil War is not a sufficient critique of of anarchism, because it's a critique that is totally imminent and compatible with Marx. It's not a critique of anarchism, because that same critique is a critique that's imminent within anarchism, right? It is not in place here to dwell on the flawlessness of Bolshevism and all its policies in the great period of the Revolution. Bolshevism's defects may be freely granted, but the oppressed and exploited of the world have not yet been offered a scientific guide to action in the struggle for freedom which can even remotely claim to serve as a substitute for the party and principles of Lenin. in the face of enormous obstacles, not the least of which were created arms in hand with the present-day bourgeois and reformist critics, Lenin and the Bolsheviks carried through the first conscious proletarian revolution. And they laid the economic foundation for the new society without class war, without iniquity or exploitation or oppression. They and nobody else gave us a picture of the truly breathtaking prospects for human advancement and human dignity which are open to us as soon as capitalism is sent to the rubbish heap. Rash indeed would be he who forecast the immediate future of the Russian Revolution, but whatever it may be, its historical achievements are already imperishable. The first steam engine may not have been much faster than the old-fashioned stagecoach if it was able to move at all, but the country's network of rails is today skimmed by speedy, advanced, streamlined locomotives, while the stagecoach can be found only in museums. The creation of the steam engine was a monumental contribution to human progress. The creation of the First Soviet Republic was an even greater contribution. History will give little place to the period of Stalinist counter-revolution, for it will treat it as a passing historical episode. That's a big Trotskyist point right here. Right, that was Trotsky's thesis. Trotsky did not want to. One of the reasons why Trotsky did not want to consider the new Stalinist ruling strata, as he often called, or I think he sometimes used the word caste. I'm not sure. I can't remember. But the ruling strata he definitely used. One reason he didn't want to categorize the new ruling strata, the bureaucracy in the Soviet Union, as a class, is he thought that it would be ridiculous to give such a transitory, passing episode any kind of consolidated, give it a consolidated character, right? He didn't want to give it he didn't want to view it as potentially a system that would have some kind of economic viability into the near future. He thought it was a chaotic mess and is either going to collapse into go even further in the direction of counter-revolution and reintroduce capitalism, or it was going to be overthrown by a political revolution in the USSR. Well, those are the two options that he seemed viable, or also the idea that it would be conquered by a foreign power and be subjected to the colonial a colony, as Shachtman already stated, which is straight up Trotsky. But this idea of Stalinism being a transitory step that is about to be that is about to disappear, is very much like just a repeating of Trotsky's analysis at this point in Shachtman's approach to the USSR. Back to the text. History will give little place to the period of Stalinist counter-revolution, for it will treat it as a passing historical episode, but the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 and its enduring achievements will never be wiped out of the consciousness of man, for it sounded the knell of all class rule, marked the beginning of the end of man's prehistory and inauguration of a new era of a new man. In this sense, Lenin and his party of revolutionary Bolsheviks could say with Ovid, Jamque opus exegi, quod nec jovis ira nec ignes, nec puterit ferum, nec hadex obulera vetustus. Which translates as, quote, I have now completed a work which neither the wrath of Jove, nor fire, nor the sword, nor the corroding tooth of time shall be able to destroy. The end. Thanks for listening. I hope you don't mind my excessive marginalia, but I feel the need to talk out loud, especially because I plan on writing about these ideas eventually. So thank you.